Barry Beal, your facilitator for today's service. Welcome to all of you here today and those on Zoom to a time of celebration and deep connection. So now let's celebrate the code of silence by silencing our cell phones. Thank you. I don't think I see any newcomers, do I? Well, that'll save some minutes.
Are we in a rush?
Yes, I am. I have a loaf of bread to bake. A reminder that if you wish to have a particular joy or sorrow or an announcement read during the service, please remember to fill out the forms in the back table, preferably before the service. For those that on Zoom, at the right time, if you wish to contribute, unmute yourselves and contribute. Or you may place your thoughts in chat, and Tina will read them. Anyone bringing greetings from another UU organization? I don't think so, because there's no strangers here. Before our service begins, we have a few announcements today. There's a box of small canning jars in the community room, and help yourself, left over from my earlier life. This is pretty interesting. There's going to be the Friday April hike. It's going to be in March because of scheduling problems. It'll be March 31st. See Molly for details. We have World Water Day is Wednesday, March 22nd. And there is a UU Water Conference from March 22nd to March 24th. There will be hundreds of small events called site events. Tricia is speaking about the Colorado River Basin in one of those events this Tuesday, along with speakers from Costa Rica, Colombia, and Egypt.
I want to point out this rogue slide. Next Sunday, we have a group called La Luna Tunes coming. Tara Kohanik, Ragida Kuri, and Cato Daly, in that order. You can see why that's one of their favorite photos. They're from Bisbee. And Tara has given me about 60 beautiful photos, one of which I slipped into the hymn with her permission today. You won't be able to tell what's her photo and what's like a professional photographer's. She does amazing photos. And as they perform next week, her photos will be in the background to enhance the music and the performance. So if you want to know more about them, Tricia knows the most, I think, of anyone here. But it looks like some of you are excited and have heard them before.
Now let's take a moment to sit in silence and listen to Richard Wilder play our prelude, samplings from the Alcots by Transcendentalist composer Charles Ives. I guess that's a wow. As we light this chalice and begin our service today, let us listen to this advice from one of the original Transcendentalists, Ralph Waldo Emerson. This is number 563 in the gray hymnal, if you would like to follow along. A person will worship something, have no doubt about that. We may think our tribute is paid in secret in the dark recesses of our hearts, but it will out. That which dominates our imaginations and our thoughts will determine our lives and character. Therefore, it behooves us to be careful when we worship, for what we are worshiping, we are becoming.
Our story for all is something I put together out of the news. Richard Spencer also really loved this story. I think it fits our topic, but it's about women and nonviolent resistance. I thought it fit here today. So it's about Bobby Wilson and her spotted lanternfly project. You may have heard this story. Lanternflies are a problem on the east coast of the U.S., but they're quickly spreading south and west. This slide shows their life cycle. Here's what they look like next to a quarter, so they're pretty big. And then where they are originally from, China and Vietnam, their population is kept in check by parasitic wasps. I don't want to think about that, but anyway, keeps them in line. And but they have invaded. They were found in South Korea in 2006, Japan 2009, and the U.S. in 2014. And they leave gashes in the plants they chew on, and their waste also hurts plants. It especially hurts profitable agricultural plants like soybeans, stone fruits, grapes. So on the East Coast this last fall, there were a lot of campaigns to eradicate them, to see them and squash them, to try to figure out a way to repel them from trees and plants. And this is what they looked like. Yep, there it is. Early one Saturday morning around 11 a.m. this past October of 2022 in Caldwell, New Jersey. That actually is from Caldwell, New Jersey. Bobby Wilson went out with a solution she had made to spray the pesky lanternflies, to see if it would work to repel them from trees, so she could catch and kill them. And she had seen recipes on TikTok that called for, it sounds exactly like what my husband has used to try to get weeds, soap, dish soap, and water. But she wanted to add apple cider vinegar. She wanted to see if this ingredient would work. And she did find them jumping off the trees into her bottle. In the next slide, you can see her stomping on them as she found them on the ground, because it's see one, squish one, because we want to stop their spread throughout the East Coast and further west. Now, a neighbor saw this small figure in a hoodie and called the police. He said there was a little black woman walking and spraying stuff on the sidewalks and trees. I don't know what the hell she's doing, scares me though. He didn't reach out to her to ask what she was doing. No, he called the police. Guess how old Bobby was then?
Looks about 10.
She was 9, and she's actually really tiny. And she has these really cute pink glasses. She really doesn't look scary. But of course the police came to check it out, and her mother, Monique Joseph, was watching her out the window and saw the cruiser go by, stop at her neighbor's house, come back towards Bobby. So she hustled outside as an African-American woman with a black child, right? But the police handled it really well. He started talking to Bobby, but once he saw her mother, he engaged her mother, and Monique really appreciated that. And so you can see, yeah, there's a policeman taking his notes, and we see the body cam with Bobby blurred because she's a minor. And then in the next slide, you can see Monique is showing him this is what she's doing. She's collecting lanternflies. And then Monique comforts Bobby. And you can see, yeah, she's like rubbing her head and giving her some love. Monique says of the incident, as a Black woman, you really don't want to have a confrontation with the police, even as an adult. And when it's your child, it's a space you mentally don't want to go to. So it was hard. But I commend the Caldwell Police Department. He did community policing. I'm grateful. You know, he talked to them. He realized this was no big deal. And he tried to de-escalate this situation. She made every attempt, Monique Joseph, to reach out to that neighbor who'd placed the call. She had mutual friends. She said, I tried that route. I even went to the chief of police in my local area and said, would you please try to orchestrate a mediated conversation between the three of us so he can understand how those words landed and what it means to us. I don't want to assume his intentions, but I understand for me how I received it. But he didn't want to have the conversation. So that pushed her to speak out. She went to the Caldwell Borough Council meeting a little bit later in the fall to speak up about it. And there you can see her talking. And she says to the council, based on everything that has transpired, I am concerned and outraged. I want this to be a teachable moment for our town on racial bias, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how we together can ensure that going forward, little Black and brown children in this town can feel safe in this community. Bobby's 13-year-old sister, Hayden Wilson, spoke out at that meeting as well. She said she spoke out because I felt the need. Bobby's my little sister. That's what I'm supposed to do. If I didn't do that, I'd feel terrible about myself. And her words were incredibly forceful. She called the episode an instance of racial profiling, and she says to the council, Bobby was not only doing something amazing for our environment, she was doing something that made her feel like a hero. What Mr. Gordon Lashy did to my sister was extremely offensive, traumatic, and scarring towards my family. I can confidently assure you guys that she will never forget this. So we know the story made local news, national news, and there was an outpouring of support for Bobby. Her mother said, I never knew how big my community was here. So it had some positive effects after she spoke out. But people throughout the country wanted to support Bobby, do what they could to remove the trauma, reaffirm her personhood, her brilliance, her, at home they call her Brilliant Bobby. You know, she was this amazing little kid with quite a mind and spirit. The Montclair Police Department had a special ceremony honoring her as a hero. Officer Erica Peterson said, I just want you to know that I am you. I see you. I represent you. And the chief, Todd Conforti, said, you're remarkable. You're resilient. I'm in awe with the way you handled this entire situation. And even the top law officer for New Jersey, the Attorney General, showed up. So that's pretty cool. And in January, you may have heard about this on the national news, professor of the Yale, she's an assistant professor at the Yale School of Public Health, Ijeoma Opara, reached out to Bobby for something unusual for Yale. We wanted to show her bravery and how inspiring she is. We just wanted to make sure she continues to feel honored and loved by the Yale community. And she invited Bobby and her family to Yale to receive the title of donor scientist. the university entered Bobby's collection of 27 spotted lanternflies into the Peabody Museum of Natural History database. And she had a fun day looking through things there. Her mother, Monique Joseph, says of her daughter, "She's not a victim, she's a champion." And Bobby says she wants to be a chemist because she likes to mix stuff, like I made the solution for the spray for lanternflies. I'll take a moment just to say, can you go to the slide for joys and concerns? There it is. That's how David took the picture for me, and I cut it down for most of the slides. I just want to say we have an amazing church of people who do many things. You can see over there and over there, the quilt made by Karen Horton, but also behind it, the cabinet made, behind it on the slide, the cabinet made and painted by Jerry Beal. You may have hidden talents we don't know about. We love talking, since we learned about it about a year ago, about Diane Davis's special talent. She used to work with hot air balloons. You may have a secret we don't know, something that would enliven our life here in the church. So think about your pledge of time and talent and treasure and your abilities to the life of this church.
Ours is a welcoming community where we find connection, a spiritual community where we find meaning. Ours is a sharing community where joys are amplified, a caring community where our sorrows are lessened. We take this moment to reflect on our joys and sorrows and acknowledge the mutual respect and mutual support of our community. I have a joy. Tina's agreed to be our full-time minister. Becky Tanner has a concern. Her husband Ken's going to undergo spine surgery on Tuesday to fuse 2 vertebrae. She asked for your thoughts, good thoughts for a successful outcome. Sweet Georgia Brown says that she made it to Boise, Idaho, and got to celebrate with her brother Earl on his 80th birthday. Hadn't seen him in 6 years, and he recently had cancer surgery. Gary Rolapaw says his sorrow is that so many of his fellow UUs are seriously ill.
So some of you know, but not all of you do, that Karen Horton has become very sick. And it started 8 days ago and has involved several trips to several emergency rooms. She was admitted to the TMC emergency room and is now in ICU. She's been more or less comatose for about all of those, 6 of those days. She's just asleep and can't stay awake. They've run a battery of tests. They still seem to have no idea what has led to this condition. I'm in touch with her sister and then reporting to a group of people who have asked to be kept informed, so the sister doesn't have to talk to a dozen people. And her sister reported that last night she was to have an EEG, and I said if there are reports by 10 this morning, then I could announce it. And I've seen nothing, and she didn't think there would be anything to report. So that's where we are. Karen is asleep most of the time, and we don't know why.
Do we have any Zoom?
Not that I see. Nope. Nothing in the chat.
I had these stones to the bowl to signify our caring community. I add these stones to the bowl for the joy of our community. I add many stones to the bowl, if I could find where I am, to reveal the commitment of joys and sorrows for the rest of the world. We make this commitment each week, knowing the life and experience of every person matters, and together our lights shine brighter together.
So you may have wondered why I chose to use Karen's quilt today as our main image for this worship about transcendentalists active in the world. Obviously, I'm thinking a lot about Karen, thinking about how blessed we are by her. But there's another reason. According to legend, in the time of the Underground Railroad, this may or may not be true, but people hope it's true and make quilts now in honor of it. People would leave quilts on their clotheslines or hanging in their windowsills as a code to let people know if this was a safe house or not. According to the Smithsonian, what I could find on Google University, a bow tie showed that you should dress in disguise and appear to be of higher status. A bear paw meant follow an animal trail through the mountains to find water and food. And this, which I believe is a log cabin quilt, maybe a maize log cabin quilt, log cabin said, "Seek shelter now. The people here are safe to speak with." Now I hope that's true of us also, that if people come to our door here, we would be a safe place. And it's a safe place to have conversation, safe people to speak with. And the quilt itself is really beautiful. You can kind of see all around it the words. If you go look at it later, you can see more clearly the words of our principles. Number one being, our belief in honoring the sacredness and integrity of all life. And you can see there's a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Many of our principles are around the outside, all 7. And in the middle, she has hands. She speaks of love. When Karen made me some masks at the beginning of COVID, she used the, not the pattern, but the material right in the middle for one of mine. So I felt like I carried that with me wherever I went. I'm hoping that we can also bear forth some of the willingness to take risk, willingness to really truly reach out to other human beings that our transcendental forefathers and mothers did. Last week I talked about transcendental spirituality and how it still touches and influences us. It's not just a dead product of the 19th century. It was a huge shift in a way of thinking in the world and in religion that still influences us. It was influenced by the Enlightenment as a response to that, to such a rigid understanding of empirical data informing our lives. It was a response to the Industrial Revolution, where human beings were becoming cogs in a wheel, becoming objects instead of valued for their inner soul. It was influenced by the Romantics and the idea that we do have this subjective understanding of the world. And it was influenced by what was happening in Germany with biblical scholarship. The books of the Bible could be torn apart and studied. Where did we get our understanding of the divine? Well, the Transcendentalists said, we have this inner soul we need to cultivate. We can see the divine in nature. We can see the divine in this oversoul that connects us with other people. There is this higher soul that we are part of. And today I want to talk about how their beliefs really push them outward into the world. Instead of just, as we often think of them, as hiding in the woods, living near Walden Pond. Guess how close Walden Pond is to downtown Concord? I've walked it. He wasn't out in the woods. This was not a survivalist mode. And unfortunately, some people have taken Walden to heart, and one young man died in Alaska doing a survivalist trek, thinking that's what was going on with Thoreau. No, Thoreau went to Walden and left Walden with the same good reasons, but he took time to reflect. You know, he also wrote the essay we now call Civil Disobedience, in which he did not pay his taxes for his land because he did not want to support a government that had gone to war with Mexico to increase slavery and a multitude of other unjust reasons. So even though our history lessons often talk about them as being ethereal, romantic, removed from the world, they really weren't. They were engaged with it. And there's some good reasons they were, partly because of their beliefs and partly because of the world they lived in. Herman Melville, who was, the writer of Moby Dick, who was a romantic, who really explored our emotional, subjective worldview, wrote about them as, if I can find it, it was really funny. He condemned those transcendentalists as kind of being hazy and dreamy and removed from the world, although he kind of was too. But in fact, they really weren't. So I'm going to recap a little bit of their beliefs. The UU minister Barry Andrews writes, "For them, religion is not fundamentally about anything. Religion is life. Or as Emerson put it, religion is neither doctrines nor rituals. It is not something else to be got, to be added, but it is a new life of those faculties which you have. If it's about anything, religion is about being alive and engaged in the world. It's about enchantment and compassion. It is about transformation and self-renewal." William Ellery Channing, an early Unitarian and Transcendentalist influenced minister, wrote, "The great end in religious instruction is to awaken the soul, to excite and cherish spiritual life." And Andrews reminds us, as religious educators, our task is not to stamp our minds on the young, but to stir up their own, not to give them a definite amount of knowledge, but to inspire a fervent love of truth, not to form an outward regularity, but to touch inward springs. And Andrew says that is still the best description of religious education he knows. Teaching the young is not about filling their heads, but expanding their horizons. It is not about charting a course for them, but about being companions with them on their own journey in life. The Transcendentalists, first and foremost, talked about growth, cultivating our own soul, being responsible for our own understanding of the world. And last week I talked about spiritual practices they use to do that, like reflecting 3 hours every morning and writing in journals. I forgot to tell you about reading as a spiritual discipline. I know some people do that. This was an important way to develop your inner life, but it didn't mean you stayed at home and didn't take on the world. Princeton professor Peter Wisbicki writes about how he thinks Black abolitionists and white transcendentalists needed each other, that they built each other up, that they grew because of each other. You would think that Black abolitionists might think this ethereal, romantic, navel-gazing group was not useful to them, but Frederick Douglass often visited a commune in Northampton, Mass., where Sojourner Truth lived, and it was influenced and run by transcendentalists. This was part of the philosophy of abolitionists as well. And Wisbicki says, Transcendentalism gave a structure that was helpful to abolitionism, but the abolitionists gave a real fiery battle struggle that brought those principles to earth. So the Transcendentalists talk about the soul, and they talk about a higher law. This is what Thoreau talks about in Civil Disobedience when he says, I'm going to break this human law because it's not a real law. It's not a sacred law. It's not a bigger law. It's not part of this true, larger soul, bigger law. And they even had a party, the Free Soil Party, who wanted lands to be free of slavery, had a higher law platform. Again, because the country kept enacting horrible laws to live with. In 1850, they enacted the Fugitive Slave Law. This was a compromise throughout the country as California was admitted as a free state. New Mexico and Utah could choose. And they fought tooth and nail about how they would structure their country, free or not, those pro-slavery, those against. And one of the big compromises was this fugitive slave law that meant, even up in New England, if you were caught helping, housing, abetting, nourishing, clothing a fugitive slave, you could be imprisoned as well. Imagine that. Imagine that in our lives now. What if, to some extent, it annoys me, almost horrifies me that within 100 miles of the border, we are pretty much free game in some ways. It's not quite like that, though, right? Not quite like that. Imagine. And imagine what it would take for you to break the law. How many people have taken part in a nonviolent protest? That might have, right. In 2020, it was mostly the Baja 4 ministers, but we got 4 of us from this church. We were the biggest representation to go to the border wall to protest what was happening with the building of the wall, destroying native lands, destroying the environment. And we had a conversation ahead of time, the ministers, are we going to do something that might break the law? Are we willing to go to prison? It's still a big conversation, right? It can have consequences. So what the Transcendentalists got from abolitionists was an example of people who'd been constantly breaking the law with dignity and power for decades. They could see it, and they could see why they were doing it. And what the abolitionists got was this framework of the idea of a higher law, and then something else that Emerson spoke about in 1837. It was a talk called The American Scholar. We were starting, because of the Industrial Revolution, to over-identify with a job. He says, you will lose your intellectual independence and spiritual integrity if your job is all you are. You cease to be a man and take on a particular role, he wrote. And those roles would bind your thinking. So if you were a U.S. Marshal, you were to act like a U.S. Marshal. If you were a judge, you were supposed to enforce the law, even if it was inhumane, and force fugitive slaves to go back into slavery. He said when a judge does that, he is no more than a Marine who is trained to turn his rifle and fire no matter what. You become a tool, an object. You are no longer a human being. You are no longer cultivating your soul. You have to think of yourself as larger than that role. And it worked in some cases. There were those people, Theodore Parker, who was seen as the theologian of the Transcendentalist movement and a strong abolitionist, said, "Let it be remembered, I am a man first of all, and that all else is but a modification of my manhood. My official business as clergyman, fisherman, or statesman is always beneath my personal duty as a man. And Charles Sumner, who later became a senator, the one who got beaten up in the floor of the Senate, he said, "I cannot forget that I am a man, although I'm a commissioner." And he would not obey the fugitive slave law as a commissioner because he was first a man. Joseph Hayes, who was the captain of the Boston police force, resigned in 1854 during an incident I'll talk more about later. It's the Anthony Burns crisis, Anthony Burns rendition. A man was sent back into slavery despite all the attempts of Boston to keep him there. Joseph Hayes resigned rather than arrest him and take him back into slavery. So some people heard that call, that you are first to be a human being and not just your role. How many times has that been a problem for you? Have you had to weigh those two things? Sometimes I think I let that role be a convenient way to not push myself, to be more soulfully myself, more courageously myself, more aware of the soulfulness of other people. Throughout this period of time, slaves were coming to New England, coming to Boston. By 1850, the time of mostly there was an agreement between the officials of Boston and those who were trying to protect fugitive slaves. Most of them were protected. There was Lewis Hayden, arrived in Boston in 1845. He had freed himself. He was a slave. And I didn't know this. August 1st, which is my birthday, used to be celebrated as Emancipation Day before the Civil War, because that's the day slaves were freed in the Caribbean by England. So on Emancipation Day, 1846, the Women of Concord, the Anti-Slavery Society of the Women of Concord, and a group of ministers invited Hayden to speak. He'd only been out of slavery 5 years. He never was a great orator. Sometimes he wrote really good essays that caught people's attention. But he went on. They had to fire him as a speaker, but he went on to do so much. He eventually ran a store that 20 years earlier had been owned by another freedman. It was a clothing store, which signaled that it was a place that you could go as a fugitive slave to get clothes. His wife ran a boarding house. That's where you could stay. There was food. They kept people moving, and as things got dangerous, they would push them out further into parts of New England and finally into Canada. But there's this really wonderful story. Early, maybe in the 1830s, a black cleaning lady grabbed and constrained a judge so 2 fugitive women slaves could be grabbed by a bunch of freed women, and released from the court proceedings. And they did that several times throughout that period. Lewis Hayden and his wife were reimbursed for helping at least 100 slaves in the 1850s. They probably helped more. And Harriet Beecher Stowe went to stay with them and found 13 fugitives in their basement, living there. All of the Transcendentalists helped, especially Theodore Parker. He took in, there was a couple, the Williams couple. She was lighter skinned, so she pretended to be a freed woman of noble or, landed, whatever means, traveling from the South with her slave, her husband. And they made it to Boston and then were found out, but they were whisked away. But the more the groups did this, the more there was resistance, the more there were guards protecting the courthouses, the more it was difficult to do. Finally, in 1854, there was that electrifying event, the rendition of Anthony Burns, who was a young man, and he had been in Boston for a while. He had worked for Hayden. He was a member of the 12th Baptist Church on Beacon Hill, which was a gathering place of many freed African Americans at the time. He was part of the community. And he wrote a letter to his brother that was published. And so his former owner and the person he'd rented him out to could find him. They came up to Boston to find him. Now, black women working in hotels could tell there were slave catchers in town, slave hunters, and they'd report them to the vigilance committee that was trying to help fugitive slaves. Unfortunately, in this case, they were not able to protect him. There was a huge meeting, 5,000 people crowded into Faneuil Hall to decide what to do. And some people wanted to remain nonviolent. Some people wanted to go immediately with arms and free him right then. Some people wanted to wait till the next morning. Some people at night. Hayden and a white minister, Higginson from Worcester, went off with axes, went to where this man Burns was being held in jail, because they saw that it was getting more fortified. And they cut a hole into the building, but they could only enter one by one. Transcendentalists often were ethereal and otherworldly and didn't understand you don't want to have one person going in at a time against a group of police protecting a prisoner. The meeting at Faneuil Hall found out about this and went over. And Bronson Alcott, there are two different descriptions of what he did, somewhat similar. He's walking on a cane. He's really romantic and detached from the world. And there's been this fight where a young policeman was killed and everyone's fleeing. And in one reported he walked inside so calm and so spiritual that the police just stood back. And he just turns around and walks back out. In another account, he walks in, he says, "Why are we not within?" And a bullet whistles by his ear, and he walks calmly out. I don't know which legend is true, right? But it shows you how our keeping of history can be altered or interesting or different. This was a huge turning point. They could not free this man. Burns was taken there's a painting of him being taken the next morning by cannon and militia and soldiers and police to the harbor to be taken back to Virginia. But as John Barron says, in civil rights, there's this thing called failing forward. You can have a failure, but you can reframe it in a way that makes more moderate people outraged and active, right? So James Freeman Clark, a Transcendentalist minister, gave a sermon, the rendition of Anthony Burns, on Pentecost Sunday, which was right after. He was marched off on Saturday. The next day, he gives a sermon. Pentecost is when the Holy Spirit supposedly came down on the early church, and people spoke in different languages, and everyone could understand what was going on. Clark says, "I blame today the churches and clergy of Boston, for if they had been faithful to their master, this could not have happened. Last Friday, Christ was crucified again in the form of that slave. This morning, I feel in my heart, he's risen from the grave. His spirit is poured out on many, a mind and heart." And they distributed 4,000 copies of that. But it had an effect. The cotton wig millionaire, Amos Abbott Lawrence, said, "We went to bed one night, old-fashioned, conservative, compromise, union wigs, and waked up stark, mad abolitionists." And another conservative minister, Ezra Stiles Gannett, his own daughter asked him what, as a Christian minister, would he do if a fugitive came to their door. Gannett said he'd provide shelter and assist in an escape to Canada, and then go to prison himself, if need be. When he was told that the military had already taken Burns back to bondage, he burst into tears. So it electrified Boston, and it pushed people who actually made out from the slave trade to join sides. In Waltham, The Congregational Church, the Methodist Church, and the Universalist Church, when they heard what had happened and that Burns had gone back into slavery, they rang their bells in protest. But it said that the Unitarian Church, their bells were clogged by cotton, and they didn't ring. So for me, this is a really powerful reminder of the combination of living in a time that calls you to really use your beliefs, to move forward, that transcendentalism was a powerful force in abolitionism, and that abolitionists encouraged transcendentalists to see a role for themselves in the world. From now on in this history, there's a big conversation about violence, and they take on more and more. And groups of Unitarians from Boston went into Kansas to preach. They also brought rifles disguised as Bibles. It got more and more violent, and we know we had a civil war, right? I don't know what I would choose in that situation. Clearly, I would have fought in the Civil War. My great-grandmother's brothers left Petersham Nass, good Unitarians, and went to fight. I'm hoping they went to fight in part because of an attempt to free slaves. The family lore is their house had hiding places and was part of the Underground Railroad. I don't know, it could be legend, but I want to believe it. And I don't know what I would do. What would any of us do if we were alive then? What would push us to violence? But I don't think we've reached that point now, and that is why I told today's story of Bobby Wilson, because I think she had been reduced to being a non-human, a scary Black woman spraying the sidewalks and trees. This person did not go by our first principle, that she had worth and dignity and agency and a soul and a mind and a brilliance. But her mother and her sister and others in this world reaffirmed that she did. The police officer who arrived did the right thing. He talked with the mother. Now, this might not be as deep as a spiritual friendship that the Transcendentalists had, and it might not be as profound as some of their thought-out conversations, but talking and connecting, they all did that. And then her mother tried to reach out to this neighbor, tried to talk to him. And when he wasn't open to that, she spoke to her community about what this meant and how it landed, and that we could learn from it. And then, of course, the assistant professor invited Bobby in and honored her at Yale, and the police department honored her. I think of it as a really great model of how to resist some of those structural racist tropes in our lives, and we can embrace our past and our spirituality, valuing the worldview of people very different from ourselves, but understanding that they have a soul that needs to be cultivated on their terms, and that we need to give them the space to do that. I still think of Monique Joseph as being this amazing mother. You know, I don't think she got up early and created potions to spray on bugs in her neighborhood, but she honored her daughter's scientific inquiry and growth. So I don't know what the answer is for all of us in the world we live in now, but I encourage us to continue the spiritual disciplines, reflection, reading, conversation, friendship, teaching in a way that honors the soul of the other. Let us keep our traditions and our power in the world alive. Thank you.
Transcendentalist and Unitarian Universalist minister and Reverend Theodore Parker carried his cultivation of the soul out into the world. Hear his words that invite us to bring our worship to all we do. They come from the reading, Be Ours, a religion which goes everywhere. Be ours, a religion which, like sunshine, goes everywhere. Its temple, all space. Its shrine, the good heart. Its creed, all truth, its ritual, works of love, its profession of faith, divine living. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we meet again. You may go in love and peace after we listen to the ending of the Alcotts by Transcendentalist composer Charles Ive, performed by our own Richard Wilder.